welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Glenn Doyle. Glenn, welcome.
It is a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Guy.
Appreciate that. So Dr. Doyle has extensive clinical experience in inpatient, outpatient, and consultation settings. He's presented multiple times at the annual conference of the ISSTD, International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, as well as the American Psychological Association. Dr. Doyle got into psychology because as a teenager, he became deeply fascinated with the self-help movement as well as literature. And as a professional, has made it his mission to bring the techniques and research base of clinical psychology to the personal empowerment paradigm of self-help. Glenn, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Where I'm from originally is I grew up in Iowa, here in the heartland, and went to graduate school in Washington, D.C., and that's actually where I started my career as a trauma-focused psychologist out in D.C., and I'm still licensed in D.C. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, I moved the whole operation, or the heart of the operation anyway, here to Chicago, Illinois. So I'm primarily based here in Chicago, but I also have a client base in D.C., and I also, like at this point, I now do consultation work with folks nationally and recently internationally as well. So
Awesome. All right, Glenn, let's dive in here. How the heck did this start for you? Share that story.
Well, it depends on what we're talking about when we say this. If we're talking about psychology generally, and getting into psychology, let alone trauma therapy. Like, I didn't actually know, but all of these things from very early in my life were kind of snowballing and conspiring to kind of move me toward the work that I do now, working mostly with trauma and addictions. So I grew up with a really intense, really intelligent, really brilliant father. And the expectations for me were super, super high. My dad was this brilliant guy. He started businesses and he was super, super charismatic. And, but like being his son came with its own set of expectations. Kind of the dark side of that, was that he also had a serious addiction problem. And so my life growing up was really kind of ducking and dodging and weaving between all of the life obstacles that you don't even know are obstacles at the time. For you, it's just life. Like, I talk to a lot of my folks now, and they say, man, I didn't realize that when I was growing up in these environments that we would now call traumagenic, like, I didn't realize there was anything weird about that. That was just life. And that's what it was like for me too. This was just life. Growing up in a house where there was, serious addiction problems, fed into like a school-based experience where I was just getting bullied mercilessly. And again, I didn't realize that was anything out of the ordinary. I kind of thought that, man, this is just life. Sometimes it sucks. Mm-hmm. I can look back now and really see that, dealing with the behavior of my dad at home and trying to kind of live the life that I was trying to live at school were really formative experiences for me. And by the time I was an adolescent, I had developed a real serious depression problem, up to and including suicidal ideation, and kind of half-assed suicide attempts. I'd also really developed a personality style that lent itself to addiction. Again, at the time, I didn't really know what that was, because gosh, I wasn't cool enough to be using any of the substances that you think of as substances of addiction. I was never invited to parties, so I never got the chance to drink. That said, I was behaving in kind of these very what I now know are addict ways with other substances and other behaviors. So anyway, I wind up as an adolescent, just miserable.
So let me, if I may, did you receive any help up to this point? Did anyone, an adult, jump in and say, Glenn, maybe you should talk to someone, anything like that?
So it's funny you should ask, because part of my experience in grade school was I was sexually abused by a male babysitter. And a few years after it happened, I told about it. And by this time, like, the guy had moved away, and there was really no accountability that could happen for the guy. But sure, my parents actually got me in to see a counselor. And I remember being there thinking, gosh, this thing that had happened with the babysitter, I knew it was supposed to have been traumatic for me. But I remember thinking, gosh, of the things that are making me unhappy, that's not even high on the list, guy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that's what the guy was asking about. That's what the counselor was asking about. So I do remember having a few sessions with this guy, and to my recollection, and I was pretty young, like at this point, I was probably in about fourth grade or so. And I remember having the experience of like, well, gosh, I think those sessions ended because there really wasn't anywhere to go with it. I don't think he quite knew what to do with me, nor did I really have, to my recollection, again, this is a long time ago, nor did I really have any, no one had really sat me down and said, this is what we're doing. Like, this is what therapy is. Like, this is how it works. This is what you can bring to it, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to when I was a teenager, and I started to get interested in self-help. So I started to, I kind of wandered into the self-help aisle of Barnes and Noble. You know how you kind of wander into the self-help aisle and you hope nobody sees you. You look around furtively.
Right.
So I started reading self-help books. And so I got the idea in my head that, well, maybe there was something here. Like maybe, this wasn't just all me sucking. Maybe I'd had some experiences, and maybe I had some challenges, some obstacles, right? And yet at the time, so I remember I asked for my birthday, for my 16th birthday, I asked my parents for a self-help book as a present. I wanted, it was a Tony Robbins book. I was interested. And so yeah, okay. I had the self-help book for my birthday, and I remember my parents just got it for me and didn't ask any questions. And I remember thinking at that point, or at least in retrospect, I remember thinking, gosh, if you're, for his 16th birthday, if your kid asks for a self-help book,
right,
maybe you'd get curious, right? Mm-hmm. Like maybe you just ask some questions, like, so kid, yeah, right. I think that kind of sent the message to me that, well, wow, I really am on my own here. I really am, kind of in a position of having to put together any kind of recovery I'm going to have on my own. I do remember when I was a junior in high school, having an anxiety attack at school. And I was hyperventilating. I know now that I'd been triggered and I was having a bit of a trauma response. But at the time, I had no idea what was going on. Like, I'm gasping like a fish out of water, and they hauled me down to the nurse's office, and eventually they got an ambulance. They brought me to the hospital, and my parents did show up. My recollection is they were furious because they had to come from work. Like, what is this drama queen doing now, right? Like, what is this kid, this dramatic kid? Like, what, we have to interrupt our day, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of arguing with themselves about like kind of who was to blame for this, and here I just wanted to shrink. And I remember being in the hospital bed, just wanting to shrink, like, oh my God, what have I done? They did get me into therapy. But the therapy was, again, it was focused on, well, Glenn is the problem in the family. Like, and I remember that vividly. Like, I was kind of, we know this term identified patient, right? Like, I was the identified patient. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't in treatment for, my recollection is a few months, because it wasn't a year, because I remember what classes I was taking when it started, and I remember what classes I was taking when it stopped. So again, off and on, it's not the case that there was no help. it is the case that there was help that I didn't know how to really utilize. It's also the case, I will tell you this, that whenever help was offered, like whenever, like at school, they would do awareness exercises, right? And they'd say, well, man, if you ever have thoughts of hurting yourself, come to us and talk to us and whatever. I remember having thought, there is no way I would do that. Are you kidding? I'll be in trouble. I vividly remember my parents arguing when I had the panic attack at the hospital. I'm like, that you get in trouble if you tell anybody, right? So in response to your question, this is a long answer to a short question, but in response to your question, sure, there was help, but man, was it really complicated to access or to utilize it in any way.
I really appreciate you sharing all that. And it just sounds like you were put into this trauma maze where there really was no escape. Even the help wasn't really sufficient. And in fact, kind of turned on you even more. So how do things unfold such that you say to yourself, all right, I want to start pursuing this?
So, well, it's really relevant to how you just framed that, Guy. The fact that even when help was available, it felt more dangerous to access it. I actually talk to a lot of people now who feel that way about engaging the mental health system, is that they, like a lot of people have the experience of, man, you get just a little too honest with a therapist and you find yourself in the hospital, or it very much felt that way for me. And ironically, where I actually found some semblance of connection and some semblance of understanding was in those self-help books that I was reading. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One, I was accessing them on my terms, and I was accessing them at my pace. And many of the better self-help books, and at this point, I've at this point, I'm board president of an organization that is, that works with, accountability and transparency in the self-help industry. So I've read a lot of self-help books at this point. But the better self-help books very often included stories, from the author's life. And I really connected with that. That turned into a real source of strength. And I say without exaggeration that, those books probably saved my life at some point, because it did give me it planted the seed of an idea that, okay, if he figured it out, if this guy was in this position, he figured it out, well, then maybe I can figure it out too. Don't know how, right? But if this situation existed, maybe I can figure that out too. It's one of the reasons why now, as a therapist, I'm very big on bringing our own personal experience to the table and how we work. Because I think part of what was happening was anytime a therapist did work with me, they were hitting technique really hard, right? Maybe they were doing, good therapy, but what I needed was that idea that this is possible for real people to do this and get through it. And that's what I got from the self-help books. Wow. Right? So I was always very into the self-help books, even as I kind of careened into what turned out to be an initially disastrous attempt at college, right? So I'm a kid who grew up with real self-esteem wounds. And I think that, gosh, how am I going to solve the self-esteem problem? My first college major, I was a music major because I was going to be a rock and roll star. I'm going to get myself a job, Guy, where at the end of my job, people stand up and say, yay, and then they buy your CD. That was how I was going to fix my self-esteem problem. And this made perfect sense to me at the time. I was so terribly depressed. And what ended up happening was I got a few months into my college career where I just collapsed and I went into a major depressive episode. I stopped going to school, essentially. Went into a really, really dark place. I dropped out of school. Wound up doing things like like playing piano in places for money. Like I was the piano man with the glass on the piano. I played dinner theater for a while, to make ends meet. But the point is, I was in this really, really dark place. Finally got to a place where I remembered the self-help books that had really got me through as a teenager. So at this point, I'm in my early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, gosh, maybe I can revisit those. And I was lucky enough to stumble upon, I still remember the day, I stumbled upon an old dog-eared copy of Feeling Good by David Burns, like the old book about CBT. It's like CBT for the masses, Feeling Good by David Burns. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll try it.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did that kind of mark the beginning of my turnaround, but that also planted the idea in my head of, how back in the day, the idea had been planted in my head that maybe you can survive this. Well, this planted the idea in my head. It's like, well, maybe you can do something like these people did in helping other people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can make the focus of your career, your life, being there for people in ways that you needed someone to be there by, like you needed, right? So in short order, I kind of righted the ship. I went right back to school. I burned through an undergraduate psychology degree in about 2.5 years. Like, that's how motivated I was. I went summers and stuff. Went to graduate school in Washington, D.C. And when I was in D.C., I was lucky enough. Like, I already had this idea of man, the kind of work that I wanted to do and the kind of patients I wanted to work with. I was lucky enough to get a job at the Psychiatric Institute of Washington, which happened to have an inpatient unit devoted to the treatment of complex trauma and dissociative disorders, right? So I was very lucky to get exposed to the fact that, man, not only can you do this kind of work, but here's how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
Here are people who are actually doing it. And here are people who are doing it with some of the patients who are in the worst possible space. Like if you're being admitted to an inpatient unit, man, you're having rough times.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I was lucky enough to, after getting into this groove of this is what I want to do, having some really great modeling. So again, I often say that, man, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now without having been just stupidly lucky, and not just lucky in the things that have happened to me, which I am, but also stupidly lucky to have had the role models that I've had. Some of them don't even know that they're role models.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I mean, I think you're articulating your whole process beautifully and in a really inspiring way. And, I want to second your sentiment about the importance of bringing your own story or one's own story to this whole process and platform, because that's what I hope my podcast is about. So already, as you're talking, Glenn, I'm thinking, all right, I've got to have this guy back on again. Sincerely. I mean, this is what it's about. But how talk a little bit more, if you could, how you made that jump to say, you know what, I want to help others.
Sure. So again, I talk so much about the importance of modeling. And one of my earliest models was, as I noted, that the self-help kind of pioneer superstar Anthony Robbins. I know that he's kind of a controversial figure, but believe me, being involved in the nonprofit work I am now, I know he's a very controversial figure. But something that really struck me about Tony Robbins' story was that he didn't really crawl out of the hole that he was in until he was able to envision a life of meaning. And for him, it happened to be, well, man, I know the resources that I might have needed, the resources that might have been helpful to me once upon a time that just weren't there. Maybe I can be that person for somebody else. It really goes back to, if you're familiar with Viktor Frankl,
mm-hmm.
Man's Search for Meaning. So Viktor Frankl is in this unbelievably unfortunate position of being in a concentration camp. And Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist, like, he gets really interested in the question of, like, well, what makes the difference between the prisoners who survive and the prisoners who don't? And he comes up with this really interesting observation. He says, man, it seems to be those prisoners who can conjure some sense of meaning, who can assign some sense of meaning to what otherwise might just be this awful nonsensical experience, that there is something to that has survival value. And Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning talks about this, about how very often the meaning that prisoners assigned to this awful experience they were having. It's like, well, man, the meaning I'm going to assign to this is I need to get through this so I can tell the world about it so it will never happen again. Likewise, Tony Robbins' meaning was that, I need to learn everything I can about human behavior so I can go on and help other people, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to be my meaning. When I take a look at what gets me out of bed in the morning and what really motivates me, and, motivation has always been a problem for me. So in addition to these other things I was struggling with, for years, I had no idea I had a bad case of ADHD. Part of what ADHD entails is what we call executive dysfunction and behavior initiation, motivation, right? Terribly hard time just getting motivated. That's why it's one of the reasons why I need these really vivid models in front of my eyes of like, well, man, this is what this could be. This is what this could possibly be, right? So having, again, these really vivid examples of like, man, Viktor Frankl found meaning in telling the world about it. And Tony Robbins found meaning in being there in ways that other people, that he needed people to be for other people. When I think about what gets me out of bed in the morning and what motivates me to do the things that I do, to write the tweets and to write the blogs, and let alone work with the patients, et cetera, I think, man, if all that is available is the kind of help that I got from perfectly well-intended people, mm-hmm. right? Like I totally believe a counselor who I saw when I was a kid, like God bless him, he was probably doing his best. Then people are, again, they're not going to get the help they need. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. When I write my tweets, so most of the material I do in terms of writing blogs, writing other things, and doing appearances and stuff. Most of them start, like I kind of work out my ideas as tweets mm-hmm. first. So if you follow my Twitter, you're getting the rough draft of this mm-hmm. idea that I have, right? But most of my ideas that start out with tweets, like, I envision the person who was me. Mm. Like I envision the person who is struggling with their trauma recovery, right? And I have this whole thing that I feel so strongly about is that, in the trauma treatment world, I feel that we tend to get really enamored of trauma therapy. Like we get really interested in the therapy because we're the therapist. We get really interested in what we do, right? Mm-hmm. I get really interested since I come from the experience that I come from. I get really interested in the experience of recovery. Like therapy happens an hour a week. Mm-hmm. Recovery is 24/7, 365. So I think about that person who is struggling with recovery, and they're struggling with, are they going to self-harm today? Right? Mm-hmm. Like, are they going to get out of bed today? Are they going to go to work? I don't know. Right? And they open up their social media app. Is there a nugget of an idea that I can plant there? That idea is really interesting and cool to me, that I can plant that idea, much like ideas were planted in my head. And I know it's possible because I had that experience. Mm.
That's a really interesting reversal in a sense. Therapy is taking place an hour a week. Recovery is taking place, filling the gaps and all that other time. My gosh. You're clearly on a mission, right? Let me just remind everyone quickly that I'm speaking with Dr. Glenn Doyle. All right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back. You're on a mission to what?
I'm on a mission to save the me who once was. Is what first occurs to me when you say that. I'm on a mission to be there. So I have a whole shtick that I do about how, look, it's nothing new. It's if you've done any kind of inner child work, that we carry with us the us that we once were, right? The kid we once were. We carry that kid with us inside our head and inside our heart. And a big task of trauma recovery is to make the inside of our head and the inside of our heart a safe place for that kid. And I'm still doing that work now, right? So part of rescuing the me who once was, part of taking care of him, part of the care and maintenance of that kid I once was, who I still carry around with me, is to help other people, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think part of what that kid inside needs, at least speaking from my own kid inside, I think part of what that kid inside needs is to know that there are people who see them, who see that, man, the resources that are available are problematic. And again, it's not even necessarily anybody's fault. They just are. It's complicated to reach out for help. So again, I think of it like in terms of a mission. Like, so I'm helping other people, and I'm blessed to be able to do that. But really, what am I doing? Really, what I'm taking care of that kid who I once was. Like the fact that I make these resources available. Another thing that I do is, like, so here in my practice in Chicago, I make lots and lots of therapy opportunities available at either low or no cost and whatnot. That's another piece of it, right? But really, what are we always trying to do? We're always trying to save and nurture and keep safe, that kid inside. I mean, we're all really working our own recovery. Like, everything you see of me, like, I'm working my own recovery. Of course I am.
What do you feel that kid needed? If you could turn back the clock in a sense, what would you have had that initial therapist do or say that would have allowed you as a young kid to be seen and or heard?
So that's an interesting question, because what first leaps to my mind was that I wish that I'd had, how to put this? I wish that I'd had someone frame the problem to me, or the situation to me, in such a way that, look, this project of finding, we'll call it happiness, because that's how kids think, right? This project of finding happiness and of not being miserable, let alone healing from an experience that you might have had. This is a large project. This is a project that begins when you get up in the morning, right? And it extends far beyond this hour. I wish that I'd had that therapist. I'm kind of glad I don't remember his name, because I feel that, like, in all these interviews, I toss him under the bus, and it's really not his fault. But I wish I'd had somebody sit me down and say, look, I get a limited amount of time with you, but you're with you 24/7. So that relationship with you, your relationship with you, that's the one you got to work on. That's the one that needs to be made safe. That's the one that needs to be, productive, right? I think that we do our best work as therapists. And mind you, there are all sorts of different types of therapists and all sorts of different types of therapy. I'm not a snob and says, it has to be done this way. I do think that as a general principle, though, like, we as therapists are the most effective when we are acknowledging straight up the limitations of any possible work that we can do, right? So I wish I'd had that therapist say, look, kid, you're up against it. You don't know it, but you're up against it genetically. You're up against it environmentally. You're up against it with this abusive experience that you had, right? And you're going to be up against it every minute that you're awake. So this is a large project. I am here to help you, and I'm not the only one here to help you. You're going to find, God, if I'd only had somebody frame it to me like, look, I, as a therapist, am not the only resource you're ever going to have. You're going to find characters in books and characters in movies and musicians and poetry and various things out there in the world that are going to help you, that are going to be your secret weapons, right? It's kind of an abstract answer to a very concrete question of, like, what should he have said? But man, like, I really think of, a model I really admire. Again, having dealt also with, some of my own addiction issues, right? A model I really admire is the 12-step model. Even though I know that, like, the 12-step model has its advantages, its disadvantages. It's not for everybody, but something I really like about it is the sponsorship model. This idea that, okay, you're going to have a sponsor. Your sponsor, you can call them when you're in a jam. They're kind of part mentor. They're kind of part coach. They recognize their limitations. They're not a therapist, right? but they've been there. Most importantly, they've been there. They have some sober time, right? So they know how you're going to get through this. They know how they got through this,
and they know they can. It's possible to get through it.
You bet.
Yeah,
you bet. I can tell you a story just real quick.
Of course.
I remember once my family was vacationing in Hawaii, and I was probably in my 20s, and we were in Hawaii, and we were doing this among the activities that we were doing. We were doing these dune buggies, driving through this jungle in Hawaii. It was very beautiful, and we stopped at one point at it was this beautiful lagoon with a waterfall, and we were swimming in the water and stuff. And our tour guide, as we were swimming in the water, our tour guide says, look, I tell this to all the tourists, and he points to the waterfall, and he says, look, if you can swim up to the waterfall, like the current is really strong as the closer you get to the waterfall, but if you can swim up to the waterfall and touch the rock, then that's the challenge. Can you do that? And so like my brother and I are trying to do it. We're swimming and we're trying to touch it. And eventually we do it. He says, okay. He says, that's one challenge. He says, the other challenge is if you can climb the waterfall, like through the spray, right? He says, I've been a tour guide here for 12 years and hundreds of tourists, only 7 have done that. And I got it in my head. And at the end, we try it, we get knocked off the thing. But I get it in my head, I'm like, 7 have done it. 7 have done it. That means it's doable. That means there's some way, that there are the footholds and the handholds there. There's some way to do this. Flash forward to, for the next several hours, I held everybody up. For the next several hours, I spent trying to climb this damn waterfall.
Oh my God.
After everyone else gave up, and I'm getting my butt kicked. I'm getting tossed back into the lagoon again and again and again. One of the other people on the tour, says to my girlfriend at the time was along with us. It said to my girlfriend, he's got to give up. And she goes, oh no, he doesn't do that because he knows there's a way up now. And eventually you get a little higher. Eventually I made it to the top of the waterfall. And I remember I'm exhausted and I'm, looking at everybody down on the shore. Who do you think I looked at? The one person I looked at. Of course, I look at my dad. My dad has his sunglasses on. He's looking the other way.
Wow.
And I'm like, man, what a perfect metaphor for so many things. But my point is, what made the difference? It made the difference that I knew it could be done. Like once you know it could be done. That's one of the reasons why, like I used to have with my former mentor, and I used to go back and forth all the time about the value of being open about our lived experiences as survivor. And she was a very traditional therapist with like, well, look, that's not our role. Like it's going to contaminate the transference and it opens us up for countertransference and we can't. And we never did agree on that because I really feel that one of the things now, of course, you need to be very clear about why you're doing it. You need to be really clear about your boundaries with it. And it always needs to be guided by clinical rationale. But one of the reasons why I always speak in terms of we, like if you look at anything I write in terms of we. I never say, this is what you will experience. And this is what we experience as survivors. Is because that flips that switch of it's possible.
Yeah, amazing. Awesome story. My God. Look, Glenn, gotta have you back. Just super, super excited. I met you and we connected, but very, very powerful. I mean, really powerful. When, or rather, how can people get in contact with you?
So my blog is at useyourdamnskills.com. My website, my practice website is at realisticlifechange.com. But I'm most visible out there on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a really great community on Facebook.
Okay.
So if you look up Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle, I used to say just Dr. Glenn Doyle, but then I always got confused with the self-help person, Glennon Doyle. There's a self-help writer named Glennon Doyle. I'm like, what are the odds? What are the odds that not only would there be a writer, but a self-help writer named Glennon Doyle?
Right.
But if you look up Glenn Patrick Doyle, my screen name is Dr. Doyle Says on all of the things. You'll find me. I'm around.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Well, look, again, great meeting you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll be in touch.
It is my pleasure, Guy. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.